Welcome to Swansea Bay University Health Board's presentation on sensory integration, an introduction to the senses for parents, carers, teachers and those working with children and young people. This will be a short introductory presentation with the aim of providing knowledge and a general understanding of the sensory systems and how they work to those with or working with children and young people. It will give you an overview of how you can identify sensory issues in children and provide some practical strategies and advice to support the young people in your life. The definition of sensory processing or sensory integration is the way in which our body picks up information from all of our sensory systems, sends it to the brain, and our brain processes and makes sense of this information in order to make an appropriate response. The schedule of this presentation will start with an introduction to the different senses that make up our sensory system to build a general understanding of what each system does and how they work. This will then be followed by common sensory integration difficulties and how they may affect a child's functioning in activities of daily living. Finally, we will look at strategies to help children that may experience sensory difficulties in order to maintain regulation and to get involved in activities that they either need or want to do. We have 5 most common senses that many of you will already be very aware of, and 2 other senses that are lesser known, however also play an integral part to our sensory experiences, which I'll go into more detail about in the next few slides. However, these senses help us to understand what's going on around us and enable us to respond and adapt to the input that we receive. So we receive information from our senses by cells called receptors, which are both in and outside of our bodies. For example, our internal receptors let us know things such as when we need to go to the toilet or when we're thirsty, and our external receptors will let us know if we are too hot or too cold, and if something is too loud or too quiet. Typically, we can then appropriately adapt and respond to this information that we receive. The first sense that we're going to discuss is the auditory sense. The receptors for this sense are found in the inner ear and gives us the ability to process a sound, such as its pitch, tone, volume, frequency, the direction it's coming from, and understand it to adapt an appropriate response. So this sense is vital for communication skills, socialising, awareness of our surroundings, and any danger that may be coming our way. So this sense has the ability to calm or alert us. For example, if we hear a fire alarm, we can process what this means and act accordingly. Alternatively, if we're listening to calming music or sounds, then this can have the ability to relax us. The next sense that we're going to discuss is the visual sense. So our eyes have receptors at the back of them and help us to interpret and perceive what we are looking at. For example, it makes us aware of our surroundings, take in our environment, recognise people and objects. Our eyes take in colours, shapes, sizes, textures and depths. There are 2 aspects to our sight: visual acuity, so that's the ability to see and the clarity of our vision, and visual perception, which is the ability to interpret what we see. The olfactory sense gives us the ability to smell. The receptors to be able to smell are located at the back of the nose, which then send this information to the brain in order for us to make sense of what we are smelling. It lets us know if what we are smelling is odorous, pleasant, strong, or weak. Can you think of an example where the ability to smell is particularly beneficial? As an example, it can let us know if we're in danger. So we can smell smoke from a fire or gas, and then this gives us the ability to be able to respond. Our sense of smell is also strongly linked with our memory, which can trigger emotional responses. For example, when a cologne or perfume reminds you of a loved one. The gustatory sense. So the receptors for this sense are the taste buds on the tongue. Our taste allows us to identify different tastes and flavours, whether something is sweet, sour, hot, or savoury. Every person is unique in that they have some tastes that they prefer over others, and some tastes of food that they will not like. Our sense of taste also has the ability to calm and alert us. Can you think of a flavour that could be alerting to the sense and one that can have a calming effect? The tactile sense, otherwise known as the sense of touch, has receptors all over the skin, and there are some parts of our skin that are more sensitive to touch than others. Our tactile sense helps us to discriminate between textures, pressure, and temperature. So the tactile sense also helps us to find and know what an object is without looking, grade the pressure we are using to pick an object up or use an object, know when something is too hot or cold, or know when something is irritating us or causing us pain. The proprioceptive sense. The receptors for this sense are located in our muscles and joints, and these provide us with a sense of awareness of where our body is in space. So this sense helps us to make sense of the movements that we make to complete a task. So for example, it lets us know that the pressure that we need, the depth needed, being able to grade the movement to be able to coordinate it, and whether to apply more or less force.
The vestibular sense, the sense in the inner ear that detects movement of our head and tells us about the speed and direction of movement. It also helps us to develop our posture, balance, and coordination. So the tiny organs in our inner ear that detect movement of our head can be stimulated by moving up and down against gravity, straight lines, shaking our head, nodding our head, spinning, and subtle movements. So some activities can be more calming to our systems, such as rocking back and forth, and some can be more alerting, such as bouncing on a trampoline. Can you think of an example of an alerting and a relaxing movement?
As we already know, our sensory system takes in information from inside and outside of our bodies and sends it to the brain to process the information. It enables us to either respond, ignore, or adapt to this sensory information. As per the example above, if we were to touch cacti, the receptors in the skin will send this information to the brain in order to make an appropriate response. As we know, a cacti is spiky and can cause us pain. Therefore, the sensory output of touching the cacti would be pain, and our adapted response would be to move our hand away. From this experience, we would know not to touch the cacti again. And some people may take longer to respond to the sensory information or may not perceive the pain as harshly as others. Our sensory system helps us to make sense of the information that we receive from all of our senses in order to carry out a task effectively. So for example, we need all of our senses when eating. So our sense of smell helps to determine the scent of our food and can help us to know what it is without seeing it, and whether we may like it or not. Our taste gives us the ability to work out the flavours. Our vision helps us to see and pick up the food, and our hearing gives us the feedback of the noise that the food makes. Touch helps us to know the texture and temperature of the food and how it feels in our hands and mouth. And our proprioceptive system helps us to know where our mouth is in space and helps to bring the hand to the mouth correctly. All of these sensory systems work collaboratively to facilitate a function. So this is known as sensory integration. Sensory integration is the ability to take information from our environment through our senses, make sense of the information in order to be able to respond to it. This happens as part of our normal development through everyday life experiences. It starts from an infant and continues through our everyday life. Our sensory systems are built upon through movement experiences and exploration of the world around us. Our senses are needed and developed in order to sit, crawl, walk, stand, and as we get older, to complete more complex tasks, such as eat, bathe, write, and ride a bike. It is an automatic system that we don't need to think about. It's part of our development. For some children, though, this process doesn't always work how it's expected. For example, the signals to their brains could be delayed, too intense, too weak, or perceived in a different way. Sensory processing difficulties can mean that a child has a disproportionate response to sensory information. They can over-respond or under-respond. As such, a child can seek or avoid a sensory stimulus based on how their sensory systems interpret the sensory information. This can then massively impact their ability to engage in activities of daily living. For example, some children can find having their hair brushed intolerable and can perceive this information as painful. Some children can find smells difficult to tolerate and have difficulty filtering this information out, whereas others can have no difficulty at all. How we feel in day-to-day can also impact how we perceive sensory information. So our emotions, if we're not feeling well or if we are tired, can impact on how we respond. Can you think of a time where you have found it difficult to filter out information or have become overwhelmed when normally you're able to tolerate the information well? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think of an example. As one example, if you're driving somewhere for the first time, you may need to turn off the radio and have complete quiet in the car in order to concentrate on where you're going. Another example could be if you're in work and have had a bad night's sleep, you may need to move around a lot more than normal in order to wake yourself up, in order to take in the information to work. Sensory processing difficulties can mean that a child has a disproportionate response to sensory information. They can either over-respond or under-respond. As such, a child can seek or avoid a sensory stimulus based on how their systems interpret the sensory information. This can then massively impact their ability to engage in activities of daily living. For example, some children can find having their hair brushed intolerable and can perceive this information as painful. And some children constantly seek movement, which can impact on them being able to sit and attend in class. How we're feeling day to day can also impact how we perceive sensory information, such as emotions, if we're not feeling well, or if we're tired, can impact how we respond. Can you think of a time where you have found it difficult to filter out information or have become overwhelmed when normally you're able to tolerate it? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think of an example. So just some examples. If you are driving somewhere for the first time, you may need to turn off the radio and have complete quiet in the car in order to concentrate on where you're going. Another example could be, if you're in work and have had a bad night's sleep, you may need to move around a lot more than normal in order to wake yourself up, so that you're able to take in the information at work and be able to work. As mentioned in the previous slide, you can over-respond or under-respond to sensory information if there are integration difficulties, which is described as sensory reactivity or modulation difficulty. If we under-respond, this means that our brain does not pick up the sensory information effectively, which can result in a child not noticing the sensory information, or it might take the brain longer to respond. For those that over-respond, our brain may perceive the sensory information too strongly, which can result in a child reacting harshly to the sensory information and can then lead to a child avoiding this information in future. Sensory discrimination difficulties, on the other hand, is where the brain has difficulty organising and using the sensory information that it receives in order to carry out the task effectively. As mentioned in the previous slide, if a child underreacts to sensory information, it could be because their brain isn't picking up the signals correctly from the sensory system. This may mean that a child is slow to react or respond to their environment. For example, they may not notice someone calling their name, and this is different to a child not engaging or not wanting to listen. So for some children that are underreactive, they may seem slow to engage or passive, and others may be quick to seek more sensory information due to their brain not getting enough of that sensory information. On the other end of the spectrum, we have overreactive processing, which is another modulation difficulty, and they may overreact to sensory information, in which the sense that sends a signal to the brain may send an intense and strong signal. As such, the child may act harshly or extremely to the sensory input. These children can have difficulty filtering out its sensory information and may become easily overwhelmed by something that others may not find difficult to filter out. This can then mean that these children have difficulty in busy environments such as classrooms, supermarkets, playgrounds, and more. They may then avoid certain sensory inputs. For example, if a hairdryer is too uncomfortably loud, they may avoid that, or seek information that they like in order to filter out the sensory information that they cannot tolerate. Children can be under or overreactive in one or more sensory systems, which can then impact on how the child engages in their activities of daily living. The difficulties experienced can cause a number of negative consequences, including the child becoming anxious, frustrated, upset, and can lead to confidence and self-esteem issues if not addressed.
When we think about sensory intolerances or sensory overloads, a child is likely to demonstrate the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response is our body's automatic stress response to a stimuli that is dangerous or that we may perceive as a danger. The physiological responses are caused by the release of a hormone called adrenaline, and the responses can vary for different individuals. The three common responses as shown on the slide is the fight response, which prepares the body to stay and fight the threat, and this can be demonstrated in physical outbursts and anger. The flight response is where a person will avoid or run away from a situation or stimuli that they perceive as a threat, and the freeze response can be where an individual becomes overwhelmed and shuts down, unable to cope with the stimuli or appropriately react to it. Think about your child and how they may react to certain sensory stimuli. Do they tend to exhibit one of the above responses depending on the situation? So the fight or flight response is an important survival response and can be helpful and important in many situations as it can help us to react quickly and appropriately in the face of danger. However, as a fight or flight response is our body's stress response, long amounts of time in this state can negatively impact on our health and can result in mental health conditions like anxiety, low self-esteem and depression, and the physical impact could be a reduced immune system, which can make an individual more susceptible to colds and illnesses. The more our body experiences the stressor and stays in this stress response, the stronger and longer the response can gradually get over time. Sensory discrimination difficulties is where a child may have a problem with making sense of and understanding the different qualities of sensory information that they are receiving, which can then cause struggles for carrying out certain activities of daily living. This can then lead to praxis difficulties, which is our ability to utilize our senses in order for our bodies to complete all different types of tasks, included and not limited to writing, using cutlery, dressing, playing sports, and more.
Now that you will have learned the background information and have some understanding about where these behaviours might come from, we can move on to the strategies. Here we will talk about the just right state, movement, and observations. The just right state is a phrase used to describe when a child is at the right level of arousal to make best use of the information. The information comes along intensely enough, but not at an overwhelming level. The brain can interpret and use the information, and the level of demand on the child is at the right level for them to succeed. A common issue that parents share with us is that their child appears fine all day in school, only to come home and have massive meltdowns. This can be frustrating, as it can be hard to understand why they are behaving all day at school but having these meltdowns at home. If you think about a child or young person who is sensitive to noise or other inputs, who has to conform and sit and listen all day, by the time they get home, their resources are depleted, and their home is often the safe place where you may see the effects of coping with the stress response. Hopefully, using these strategies will help your child cope with this stress response and the meltdowns will lessen. One really basic sounding strategy is movement. Moving throughout the day is a massive yes from us. Simple movement breaks where the child can get up and move about is a great starting point. This can be as simple as distributing books to the class, helping tidying up after class, or simply getting up and moving. We are largely thinking about our sense of movement here. In other words, proprioception. If we remember that the tiny receptors in our muscles and joints give us feedback about how our body moves, the aim in active movement is to increase this information coming in through the receptors. We do this by either increasing the amount of stretch in the muscles or the amount of work that the muscle needs to do. We increase the amount of work through pushing, pulling, and making things heavier. Getting your child to do this active movement is a safe and effective way of supporting your child to stay focused and get into a ready state. Movement sounds like a really simple strategy, but it does work. The proprioceptive system is calming. Active movement helps a child who is in an overwhelmed state to get calm and organised. It can help a child who needs topping up to get a bit more input. Movement is great for building strength, stamina, and improving coordination. One thing we would like you to consider here is that the movement activity is at the right challenge for the child. If this is too difficult, the child may become frustrated and give up. Observing your child doesn't have to be a formal activity. Simply watching your child do different activities will help you see what they find useful and what they find more of a challenge. It's important that you try not to label or diagnose your child yourself. This can lead to frustration further down the line. Instead of trying to self-diagnose, what is useful for you to do is make notes of the activities your child is doing that lead them to being in the just right state. Think about whether the response is consistent over time. Sometimes a child's response is delayed. For example, it might be something that they did earlier that day at school that has helped them rather than the here and now activity. You can also consider what your child was doing before noticing a difference in their behaviour. For example, did they appear very hyper after playing on the swings or trampoline? Or did they appear calm? Notice what environment they're in and take note. When observing your child, look out for the signs of sensory overload. Children and young people might not be able to tell us how they're feeling, so it's really important that we look out for these signs. And just like the positive effects of sensory strategies, the negative signs can also be delayed. Some signs of sensory overload are flushed or pale face, sweating, fast breathing, the child appearing quite agitated, a sudden increase or decrease in arousal, the child appearing very tense, and the child saying that they feel sick. Older children and those with a good understanding of their sensory needs might be able to communicate to us that they are overwhelmed and how we can help. If you've noticed a child is overstimulated by visual input, there's simple strategies you can use, such as using blinds to limit the amount of light that's let into a room and block out direct sunlight. You can change the lighting in the room to a softer light, leaving just enough light to do what's needed. The child might prefer to wear a hood or cap if they're outside in the bright environment. You can also set up a pop-up tent to create a dark, calm space for them to retreat to. It's really important as well to consider the bedroom space. If a child is visually stimulated, it's better to have a clear, uncluttered visual space in their bedrooms to help them get settled for sleep. Similarly, if they're struggling in the classroom with bright walls, with pictures everywhere, it might be worth considering a little space for them to sit where there's not so much going on to visually distract them. If you've noticed your child is sensitive to touch, try to position them where they won't accidentally be brushed past. For example, in school, allow them to stand at the back of the line where they're less likely to be pushed and shoved by other children. This could be in the dinner queue or waiting to get into class. For a child who is sensitive to clothing, consider desensitising the skin before dressing by giving firm, deep pressure, and have a look at the programmes on the website for more specific strategies. Grade exposures to new textures. For example, if your child pulls away from messy play, start off with dry textures and work your way towards the messier textures. Again, please look on the website for a detailed programme. For children who are seeking out tactile input, fidget toys and feely boxes and plenty of opportunity for messy play can really help. If a child is sensitive to smells, this can feel like a really difficult thing for us to help with, but there are basic little things that we can do to help. For example, you can now get unscented shower gels, toothpaste and household cleaning products. If we can warn a child before the smell happens, for example, if you're going to cook something that you know they dislike the smell of, giving them plenty of warning and preparation can help with this. If a child can carry an alternative scented item with them, for example, their favourite scent on a tissue, this can really help them throughout the day. At school, it can be really difficult to avoid smells. For example, the canteen can be quite overwhelming for a child. If this becomes too much for them, it could be worth considering a separate room for them to eat in. Again, being sensitive to hearing is something that feels quite difficult to help with because there's so many noises in the environment that are just out of our control. But there are some basic things that we can do to help. For example, reducing background noise. A child can wear ear defenders, and where a child is a bit more conscious about their appearance of wearing these, they can just listen to music that they like quietly in earphones. You can prepare a child for noisy environments. For example, if going into assembly, you know it's going to be quite noisy initially, or if you go into the shop, so help and prepare the child for this will be of great benefit. If you can keep noise levels consistent, this can really help, as a sudden change in the volume could startle the child and set off that fight or flight response. In a classroom, you can try to create a quiet workspace if a child is quite easily distracted. We hope you found these strategies beneficial. If you are still struggling and need more detailed programs and strategies, please do look on our website, as there are lots of programs on there depending on the child's difficulty. Please click through the rest of the presentation for some common questions from teachers and parents. I have a child in my class who cannot sit still during carpet sessions. How can I help? This is a very common question that we get asked by teachers, so here are some basic things that you can try. If you use parameters, this can be something as simple as a hoop or a spot for them to sit on, and if you can make it personalised to them, for example with their favourite cartoon character or even just their name, this can help motivate them to sit on there. If you're finding that they're seeming quite disengaged and sort of sleepy whilst they're sat down on the carpet, you can try things like a move and sit or a wobble cushion, which might give them the input that they need to stay alert. You can allow them to sit against a wall. If you're finding that they're finding it hard to sit up straight, it might be that they need some support. You can use a weighted lap pad, which will provide the proprioceptive or deep tactile input, which is calming. You can provide a fiddle toy, which again will help keep them in that just right state and a bit more alert. You can build up the amount of time they're expected to sit for. So instead of expecting them to sit there for the whole book, for example, start off by just the 1 page and then the 2 pages, etc. You can also engage them in calming and focusing activities prior to the sedentary ones. So if you have a look at the sensory circuits book, that'll give you some more information on that. I have a child in my class who frequently mouths objects and chews on their pencil. How can I help? Again, this is quite a common one that we have where a teacher will ask us for help because the child is chewing their clothing or their pencil or a pen top. Some things that you can try if they're sort of looking for that input is allowing them to drink from a sports bottle, drinking thick liquids through a straw, offering them crunchy snacks which will give them that input, using chewery as an alternative to chewing on a pencil, and encourage blowing activities, so blowing bubbles, table football using a straw to blow through, and encourage pushing and pulling activities prior to sitting down to do their work. Why are there more children who have sensory difficulties being observed in schools? And this is a really good question, and it could be down to a number of factors, but the classroom environment can be very overwhelming and it can overload children when you think how noisy they can be, how much visual stimuli is on the walls and how busy it can be with children brushing past all of the time. So as a result of this, some children may experience difficulty in filtering out these sort of unnecessary input, and that might make it difficult for them to remain in a calm and alert state for learning. It could also be down to an increased parent and teacher knowledge. So we know and we understand a lot more now than we used to. So I think it's a really good thing that we are more aware of these things because we're more able to help the children then and help them to reach their potential at an earlier stage. My child is constantly on the go, climbing furniture, jumping and running. How do I help? Again, this is quite a common one that we have from families where they say that their children are sort of always on the go and they never seem to run out of energy. And this might be a sign that your child is seeking out movement activities. As a nation, we are probably a lot more sedentary than we used to be. So it's really important for lots of reasons that we give plenty of opportunity for the child to move around freely. So using trampolines, heavy work activities, which we mentioned earlier in the presentation, just running around, go to playgrounds and parks and sports activities. Swimming is also a really good one. This can help them give them the input that they're seeking out. If they're struggling to sit down for work activities or winding down for bedtime, if you're finding that they're still really sort of wound up, also try the heavy work and the proprioceptive calming activities. If you have a look on the website for calming activities before bedtime and the proprioceptive programs, they have lots of ideas as well to help you. Why is my child head banging and how can I help? This again is quite a common one that we do get asked by parents and health visitors. It's really difficult to say because it could depend on a variety of factors, but some of these factors are, it could be sensory, where the child is seeking vestibular and proprioceptive movement, which is achieved from banging the head. They might like that feeling. Sensory, it could be an attempt to avoid other sensory information. So if they're too visually stimulated, or if they're very sensitive to noises and there's a lot of noise going around, they could be attempting to avoid that by banging their head. It can also be behavioural, so it doesn't always have to be sensory. If you observe your child and see, is this in a response to being told no? Are they frustrated? Are they trying to communicate something with you? Things that you can try are redirecting the behaviour, distracting them, and what's really important here is to work out the trigger. If it is sensory, try to offer plenty of other opportunities for the vestibular and proprioceptive senses, which again you can find activities on our website. My child doesn't like brushing his teeth and is very fussy about the textures of clothing he will wear. Help. Again, you're not on your own with this one. We have this quite a lot, and it can indicate that your child is tactile defensive. So if you think back to the beginning of the presentation, the tactile sense is the sense of touch. So what you can do is look on the website for the Sensory Strategies for Dressing programme and the Oral Desensitisation programme. There's lots of other programmes on there as well, which you might find useful. You can consider the use of a reward chart for brushing teeth, and a social story can sometimes help to explain why brushing the teeth is so important. Also consider the use of visuals to support self-care routines and give plenty of time for these activities. So we know this is really difficult of a school morning, but the times where you do have a bit more time, for example on the weekend, just give plenty of time for the toothbrushing and getting dressed. If this is a stressful situation for your child, just giving them a bit more time and a bit more support through visuals so they know what to do next. This can be really beneficial.